Welcome all, and thank you all for participating in our study of this book, this eye-opening book on segregation and its roots. For those of you who were here last week, I'm glad we didn't chase you away. For those joining us for the first time, welcome. If you haven't done so, please identify yourself and your affiliation, if you can do that in your Zoom profile. Um, and since we did introductions last week, I'll quickly go through them again. Uh, again, I'm Guy Moody, ruling elder at St. John United Church in Columbia, Maryland. And along with my, again, dear friend and colleague, Sharice Jordan Moore, a ruling elder at Knox Presbyterian in Baltimore City, who's also here tonight, we are the co-chairs of the Presbytery of Baltimore's Dismantling Racism team. The 6-week study is a collaboration between the Dismantling Racism team and In the Loop, one of the Presbytery 6 ministry groups. In the Loop has Kenny Walker, who's also a ruling elder at Knox as its convener. Kenny is on the road traveling tonight, but will be back with us next week. Continuing to keep things moving along in Zoom tonight will be Presbytery Communications Director Frank Pirelli. We depend on Frank to keep everything current and moving on this project. We couldn't do it without him, and that's for sure. So thank you, Frank. Other leaders with us tonight who have helped pull this study together or are volunteering to help with small group breakouts are, let's see, I'm gonna have to pull up another list because we've ended up with even more people than I thought we were who are helping out. But anyway, I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that in a couple minutes. Tonight we will be getting a wonderful talk from Mr. E. Evans Paul, who will be introduced to you in a moment. Thank you for Ev for stepping up and leading us tonight. We greatly appreciate it. Tonight, we're going to dig a little deeper into de jure segregation as opposed to de facto segregation. This is the predominant theme of the book, and we'll continue to explore it in the weeks ahead. We believe, as I said last week, it's important to dive deeper and honestly into the many ways our country steeped in its white supremacist dogma and actions. If we are ever going to right the injustices of more than 400 years and live fully into the loving body God calls us to be. We're so glad you're taking this deeper dive with us. It is so important, and we just can't thank you enough for taking your time to be with us and to be doing this study. So for now, I will turn things over to ruling elder Annette Snyder to lead us in a responsive litany. Annette.
I'm just fixing my camera here and bringing up the litany for you. I hope. Sorry. I actually have it open, but it's on a different screen. Very sorry, I'm almost there.
Okay, that's why this is live TV.
I can share it if you'd like, Annette.
If you already have it, Chris, I'm very close, but if you have it, please do.
Okay, I'll go ahead and do it. Or try to anyway.
We developed this litany so that we can all work together and be of one mind during this evening. You can mute your mic so that we don't have a cacophony of voices, even though that might be okay. Chris, if you don't mind and read the people for me, keep your mic open. Our dismantling racism litany. I will see racism with spiritual eyes.
because that is how God sees me,
I will listen with spirit-filled ears.
because that is how God hears me,
Because I will speak words of truth and reconciliation.
because that is how God speaks to me.
I will do what I can to dismantle racism.
Because that is what God wants for his people.
In this struggle,
I will run and not be weary.
in this struggle,
I will walk and never faint.
and together, we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Thank you.
Now we will turn it over to Chris, a man of many talents, so that he can introduce our speaker tonight, Chris.
I am very pleased to welcome E. Evans Paul as our speaker tonight. A Northwest Baltimore resident, E. Evans Paul is a retired city planner and author of Stop the Road, Stories from the Trenches of Baltimore's Road Wars, a detailed account of Baltimore's 40-year battle over the expressway plans. Mr. Paul's 45-year career took him from the Baltimore City Department of Planning to managing Baltimore's Brownfields Initiative, and then to the Northeast Midwest Institute and to the National Brownfields Coalition. He eventually started his own consulting business, Redevelopment Economics, and he's won a number of awards, including the Brownfields Leadership Award, the Phoenix Award for Brownfields Redevelopment, the Governor's Smart Growth Award, and a Professional Achievement in Economic Development Award from the Maryland chapter for American Planning Association. So please join me in welcoming E. Evans Paul.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Guy, and thank you all for including me in this important discussion. Let me. Am I coming in loud and clear?
You sound great to me.
Okay. Let me start with just a little note about why I wrote this book. It was really the quintessential untold story in Baltimore's history, but there were really three stories in one that I think this book was able to capture. There was the amazing story of saving the waterfront in Baltimore. Those highways were all channeled through Baltimore's historic waterfront communities, and Federal Hill, Fells Point, and Canton were all saved because of the road warriors. There's a related theme that I found very intriguing, which was the populist point of view that this was quite an amazing victory of those folks who were more or less powerless, the outsiders over the insiders and the powerful. And I wanted to get into the nitty-gritty of exactly how that happened. And the third theme, and that's the one we're mainly talking about tonight, is that the road wars is also a very revealing window into the city's unfair treatment of its African-American population. Next slide, Chris, please. Starting in 1940, expressway plans were developed for Baltimore. And then in 1944, Robert Moses came to town. I assume you all know who that is, the New York highway and public works mogul. He was brought to Baltimore to try to break the log jam and get the highway built. Luckily, he did not succeed. Now, Mr. Moses was I think you could say he was pretty racist, and you could say that was probably not atypical for the time, but he was very explicit about the Negro removal aspect of planning the highways. There are two quotes here. One, the more of these neighborhoods, everybody knows what these neighborhoods are, that are wiped out, the healthier Baltimore will be in the long run. And we do not propose to tear down familiar and cherished landmarks which cannot be replaced. Nothing which we propose to remove will constitute any loss to Baltimore. So Moses kind of hangs himself with his own words. But as we move through these examples, it also behooves us to look a little deeper than just the blatant and malevolent use of highways for Negro removal, quote unquote. We also need to look at the sometimes legitimate use of highways for slum clearance, and that's where it gets a little more complicated. Next slide. We're skipping to the 1961 10D plan here. And I'm going to ask you all to focus on the three neighborhoods that we're going to be talking about in this presentation. Starting at the western side of the city, the highway goes through Leakin Park, and then it slices diagonally through the middle-class African-American community of Rosemont, and then through Harlem Park and Poppleton, what has now become known as the Highway to Nowhere. And then it veers south of downtown and slices through the Sharp Leadenhall community, another African-American community that we're going to talk about. Let me back up a little bit here and talk about how this relates to the book. I think that the highway story in Baltimore, mostly it's a very complementary story to the Rothstein book, and in some ways it fills a bit of a gap that he did not address in a lot of detail. When you get to the local initiatives chapter 8, I believe it is. Hopefully some of you have gotten there already. He does spend a couple pages on highways going through African-American neighborhoods. The chapters that are under discussion today, I will talk about individually as they relate to the issues that Rothstein raises. Next slide. So we're now focusing in on that African-American community, Rosemont, that is essentially the connector between the highway coming through Leakin Park and then down into the Franklin-Mulberry corridor known as the Highway to Nowhere. Rosemont was a solid middle-class African-American community. It was probably blockbusted in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and it made a fairly rapid transition from white to black. It had a very high homeownership rate. It was well maintained. And if you can picture a similar white neighborhood, you would probably say that it would be very unlikely that the city fathers would guide a highway through the middle of the community. But that's exactly what the city fathers did. They did not really look at alternatives to going through Rosemont. This is the engineering mentality of essentially, using a straight line to connect 2 points, Leakin Park to the Franklin-Mulberry corridor. Let's go through it on a diagonal. That's the most direct, least costly route, and the community was essentially just sidelined. Acquisition occurred in 1967. 780 houses were acquired and people were relocated. But opposition swelled. The two acronyms here, I'll be referring to these. RAM is the Relocation Action Movement, and they were a predominantly African-American organization that advocated for all the African-American communities in West Baltimore. And MAD is the Movement Against Destruction, which is a citywide organization and a multiracial organization, and was an amazing ally for the Rosemont folks. So next slide. Rosemont did succeed in having the highway relocated essentially around Rosemont. It took a piece of the Gwynns Falls Park, and it took a piece of the cemetery there where the big black dot is. And it was an incredible win for the community. The folks you see here, Joe Wiles and Mary Rosemond, they were the community leaders. Joe Wiles was the consummate kind of wheeler dealer, if you will, a great communicator for the community, and he made an appeal to, we think, to the Federal Highway Administrator, and the Federal Highway Administrator was the one who told the city he will not approve the route through Rosemont. I say it was an incredible win, but it was a disastrous defeat at the same time. The reason is that Rosemont's social fabric was destroyed. All those homeowners that got such great care of their property and had such pride in their community were scattered to the winds, and those houses were not torn down. They were renovated by the city, but when they were reoccupied, the neighborhood was really never the same. The city used a low moderate income housing program to reoccupy those houses. A lot of those folks were not really prepared for the challenges of homeownership and the high rate of upkeep in the neighborhood became a detraction instead of an advantage. Rosemont also had an advantage in that, and next slide, Chris, in that they were part of a huge part of the citywide movement against destruction movement. The guy I've highlighted here, Stu Wexler. He was a veteran of CORE and the Relocation Action Movement, and he was the first president of the movement against destruction. And the movement against destruction was the earliest, largest, and most effective Black-white coalition, certainly going backwards in Baltimore and possibly going forwards too. It was very active from 1968 to 1975, and they were an amazing ally for the Rosemont folks. And they brought folks from Southeast Baltimore, Highlandtown, Canton, and so on into the Rosemont hearings. And it was really a show of strength. Now, in relation to the chapters in the book, I would say the Rosemont story relates most to the white flight section, because that's 780 families relocated out of Rosemont. going mostly northwest in Baltimore. And actually, it was some of the Rosemont relocatees that were the first African Americans who broke what was called the white noose around the city by going into the county in the northwest Randallstown section. But there was a domino effect of white flight, and now this was a time when it was still very difficult for African American families in the housing market, but it eased up a little bit, just enough to create replacement housing for these folks, even though it was a very unfair situation. Next slide. Moving eastward to Harlem Park and the Highway to Nowhere. This is where the relocation action movement was most active. And there was a political calculation that was made by the leaders. I'm picturing John Wells and Esther Red as the two main leaders of the relocation action movement. The political calculation was this, that Harlem Park didn't have any of the issues that provided leverage for the highway opponents in Southeast Baltimore. Historic preservation. They didn't have a park like Leakin Park. And so there was no regulatory legal angle for them to oppose the highway. So instead, they concentrated on what was called replacement value instead of fair market value. And they had an amazing win. It was just so impressive. They got through first the Baltimore City Council, then the state government with Governor Agnew, and thirdly with the Federal Highway Administration. They got through a change that allowed for what was called replacement value, and that was translated to $5,000 over fair market value that the city and the state were required to pay, so that people were made whole. Now, $5,000 doesn't sound like much to us today, but that translates to, I think, $43,000 when you take into account the consumer price index. So it was an amazing win, but it was not a win for the neighborhood. Next slide. So most of the plans that were adopted, and there were quite a few from 1940 to 1972, included going right through the Franklin-Mulberry corridor. And then in 1972, there was an injunction against the highway through Leakin Park. And this is where Mayor Schaefer's decision-making really does not hold up very well to hindsight. Despite the fact that there was an injunction against the highway through Leakin Park, William Donald Schaefer decided to go ahead with construction of the Franklin-Mulberry corridor in 1973, 1 year after the injunction. Now, the injunction had conditions that were potentially solvable, but the city never solved them. The city never even went back to court. So Schaefer's decision-making just looks abominable in this. Now, what should have happened? I'm gonna hold off on that. I'm gonna on the what should have happened. Anyway, and then in 1981, the city traded in funds for the remainder of I-70. And that's why you have the isolated section of I-70 that connects up to nothing and is a complete embarrassment and a symbol for all that is wrong with highways and race in Baltimore. Next slide. In 1968, there was an interesting proposal made for how to make Harlem Park and Poppleton link up and be restored to a degree. If you look closely at this design, you'll see the highway is underneath a platform. And right, thank you, Chris. So this was a far-sighted plan. It would have taken 3 blocks over the Franklin Mulberry corridor. You remember Franklin Mulberry is kind of down in a ditch, so this is possible to do. And the proposal was to knit those 2 communities back together with a platform over the highway, and then build on top of that platform with housing, mixed use, community services, parks, and so on. That plan was dropped in 1973, and it's hard to tell now. The question mark here, was the community duped? Was the community kind of talked into putting up with the highway, thinking that this platform was going to be built? I go into some detail in the book, and I don't think that this was a malevolent attempt to fool the community, but the platform idea had quite a few problems with it. As soon as the city condemned the Franklin Mulberry corridor, blight went out from that corridor into the adjacent blocks. And by the time the city was ready to construct the highway in 1973, it simply made no sense to put $6 million into a platform when the vacancy rate in the adjacent blocks was so high. So the plan fell by the wayside. It's an interesting one, but one that was deemed not feasible. Next slide. So before I leave Harlem Park and the highway to nowhere, I should relate this back to, maybe Chris, go back to the last slide. I should relate this back to the book. Mr. Rothstein, in this chapter on public housing, talks about how public housing was a form of segregation, and it kind of marginalized poor African-American populations. So how this relates is that many of the folks in Harlem Park were borderline poor or truly poor, and they couldn't afford private replacement housing, so they became candidates for public housing. And the problem in Baltimore was that there was great resistance to any outward push of public housing that would be low density, that would be in interracial or white neighborhoods. So the solution was essentially to build high rises ringed around downtown. And those high rises became centers for every social problem that is connected with the ghetto. So those high rises were huge mistakes. Most of them have either been torn down or have been converted to elderly housing. And it's once again an area where I think we were very short-sighted. Now back to the next slide, Chris. Okay, moving to Sharp Leadenhall. How are we doing on time?
I think we can take maybe a few more minutes.
Okay, all right, Sharp Leadenhall, the third African-American neighborhood. If you don't know where Sharp Leadenhall is, it's kind of nestled in between Federal Hill and the football stadium. Sharp Leadenhall has an amazing history as a center for African-American freedmen. And there's an interesting history there that I just can't resist doing a little sidebar on. The source of the interest of African American freedmen in Sharp Leadenhall goes back to the Quakers and the Germans who occupied the area southwest of Baltimore pre-Civil War. And the Quakers, of course, were vehement abolitionists, and they were very active in helping African Americans. They helped start the first African-American church, the first African-American school, the first abolitionist society that was south of the Mason-Dixon line. So the Quakers essentially created a fairly friendly environment for African-American freedmen. But it's also very interesting. There's one guy, Elisha Tyson, who Tyson Street is named after. And Elisha Tyson was not only an abolitionist, he was on the Underground Railroad. He was a wealthy guy, and he used his wealth to pay the legal costs of, they think, thousands, at least more than 1,000 African Americans to get freedman status. And he actually employed a group of vigilantes, you could say, who went after the Southerners who were coming to Baltimore and kidnapping slaves and former slaves and taking them back south. This is a story that ought to be a Netflix series, I'm telling you. Anyway, Sharp Leadenhall was subject to what I've called the trifecta of slum clearance. There were two highways, first 10D modified, then the later 3A. Next slide, please. And then in 1975, the area was also subject to urban renewal. The Otterbein homesteading area took several blocks of Sharp Leadenhall. So the graphic here shows I-70 going through Sharp Leadenhall on an east-west axis. I-70 was actually not built, but there was a lot of acquisition that happened, and I-95 coming up from the south. So Sharp Leadenhall was right at the intersection of those two superhighways, one built and one not built. It was a very active African-American community, very poor, but it was not a well-maintained neighborhood. It was the kind of neighborhood that gives you pause on whether or not it would ever be justified to use highway funding or urban renewal funding for clearance of a very rundown area. But the problem is that planners and engineers only know the numbers and they don't know the social fabric of the community. And from all reports I've been able to gather, Sharp Leadenhall had an amazing social fabric. And and there were churches and stores and folks worked together, even though they were very poor, and the housing was run down. So anyway, so 3,000 people lived there before the highways and urban renewal, 500 after the highways and urban renewal. Next slide. Uh, Mildred Moon, whose picture I had on the slide. Yes, right. Thank you, Chris. Mildred Moon led an amazing community effort to replace some of the lost housing with new affordable housing. And these are the pictures of the projects that Mildred Moon championed and was finally able to get built. So it's not all bad news for Sharp Leadenhall. At least they were able to build some affordable housing. And a lot of the folks who had been dislocated by the highway or urban renewal actually did come back to that new affordable housing. Next slide. This is what I was referring to as to what should have happened in 1973. Remember in 1972, Leakin Park was enjoined. At the same time, the highway through southeast Baltimore was facing enormous legal challenges. And if you think about it, look at the red line. The red line follows essentially the same corridors as I-70 through West Baltimore and what was I-83 going through East Baltimore. If Schaefer had been open-minded to substituting a transit project instead of a highway project, and that became possible in 1973 when Congress modified the Highway Trust Fund, Baltimore could have had a much earlier version of the Red Line, and it would have been an amazing asset to all those communities. But Schaefer had highway blinders on. Eventually, when he traded in the highway funds for transit, it was not impressive. It was about 40%, about 35% went for transit. Most of it went to other highways and streets. Okay, next slide. The book, you might notice that Barbara Mikulski has not been mentioned so far. I really wanted the book to bring out the unsung heroes, like Joe Wiles and Mary Rosemond, John Wells, these guys who had amazing accomplishments and are basically unknown in Baltimore. Mikulski did an amazing job, but she's kind of gotten she's a sung hero. I wanted this to highlight the unsung heroes. And last slide. And feel free to use my clever QR codes to buy a book or go to some of these interesting articles. And that's it.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I'll turn it back over to Guy now.
Yes, thank you, Ev, very much. And, I recognize that everybody here is not from Baltimore or even from Maryland. For those of us who are, this is a good, a very good overview of what's happened in Baltimore in terms of what highway construction and road construction did to African-American communities. If you're not from this area, or if you're originally from some other area, I invite you to look up the similar projects that happened in other cities. I'm originally from New Orleans. The very, very similar thing happened in New Orleans, destroying the fabric of many African-American neighborhoods that could never be redone in that way. So I would just encourage you that this would, I hope, would give you the interest to move on to look at other projects that were so similar, and the destruction that it has caused to African American communities throughout our nation. Thank you, Ev, for that discussion of what happened in Baltimore. So we're going to now break out into our small groups in just a moment. I do want to, before we do, and I was going to introduce, but I had to add more people into the group and I didn't want to leave anybody out. So the people who are going to be assisting in small group breakouts will be in the alphabetical order. Ms. Brenda Alston, Ms. Jan Baird Adams, Ms. Lisa Beecham, Reverend Hal Bennett, Reverend Dorothy Bolton, Ms. Valerie Caldwell Johnson, Mr. Bobby Hall, Reverend Jesse Lowry, Reverend Deborah McCachran, Ms. Carol Norris Shortle, Ms. Annette Snyder, who already spoke a few minutes ago, and Ms. Nzinga Snyder, as well as Chris Watson, who's putting on his next hat, and myself. So we will be going into those breakout sessions in just a moment. I do want to very quickly remind us, especially for those who haven't been here before, of the ground rules that we've created to make sure we have safe and open discussions between our participants. Again, they are discussed in more detail on our website, on the Baltimore web page for this study. So I invite you to look at them again. But just very quickly, what's said in the group stays in the group. Listen carefully and with respect, allowing others to talk before you speak again. And so that everyone who wants to speak can be heard, try to make your points as succinctly as possible. Raise your hand using the Zoom feature if you wish to speak to ensure an orderly flow and to make sure your facilitator sees you. If you just raise your hand like this, it won't work. I hope by now we all know how to do that. If anybody doesn't, ask your facilitator to quickly show you when you get into your room, but I think we all know how to raise our hand using that feature. Speak for yourself using only I statements. Remember the ouch, oops principle that I spoke about in length last time. Listen openly if something you have said has offended. Listen openly, don't become defensive. And especially this is true if one commits a microaggression against a sibling of color. Please read the Touchstones for Courageous Conversations linked on the website and live into it if you haven't already read it. I'm going to add one ground rule that isn't on the written list, and that is please make yourself visible by turning on your camera if possible when you get into your breakout session. Our facilitators will give each of you a chance to identify yourselves before the discussion. We didn't necessarily do that last week, and that was a shortcoming. We want you to be able to say who you are and what your affiliation is. If your video isn't working or you have a good reason for not being visible, please tell us. We'll never require anyone to speak if you don't want to speak. That's purely up to you and what you're comfortable saying. But we do want to be able to see each other if possible, since we can't see each other in person. That's the next best thing. Oh, and I will say, people have asked me if why we don't have question and answers after our speakers sessions, because we don't have time, unfortunately. I mean, I'm sure we would have questions for all of our speakers, but we hope that the breakout questions will make up for that. And I think we have some really good ones tonight. So with that, Frank, would you break us out into breakouts, and we'll see you back around 5 minutes to 8 for a wrap up.
Hi, you are welcome to jump into any rooms you like. Good to see you, though.
Frank, this is
Yeah.
Dorothy. I got assigned to the wrong breakout room. I wasn't with Guy. Instead, I was with Chris.
Um,
And that was breakout room 5.
you were in 5 and should have been in 7.
Okay.
That's the one Guy is in.
Okay.
So
Yeah, that's where I want to be. Thank you.
can you ask one of them to leave to balance the group? When
One
you
of the
get-
people,
when
the
you
regular
get-
participants, send them to you.
When you get to Guy's group,
Right.
kick someone out of there.
Yeah. Okay.
So I can put them in a.
Go back to 5. Okay. All right.
Are you at liberty to choose the room? It's number 7.
How?
Go to more. Let's see here. Maybe I could do it. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Wait. Move to. There we go.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Hello.
So
Hi.
Hi, Vet.
now that everybody is coming back, these conversations go by too quickly.
They
Such
do.
such great questions, and thank you all for participation. This very important topics, and just looking forward to next week. Next week we will be having the Presbytery's own James Parks, who just will be. I can't wait to hear his talk. He's just. It will be very fascinating. So come on back, invite your friends. If there's people who, I mean, it's never too late to start this group. Have some catching up in the reading to do, but we're just looking forward to more people. The more, that's the better.
You've got a raised hand.
Guy,
Yes.
I would like to know if from the gentleman that was speaking in the beginning, he mentioned, did beer save Fells Point? And I was trying to look it up and couldn't. I'd love to know, was that an article that I could find or was it a book?
I think it was just maybe, I wouldn't know, and maybe just a little bit of whimsy there, but I think because there are so many places that have opened at Fells Point, we would have to be able to ask him, and
He's gone.
yeah, and besides, unfortunately we can't entertain questions, Carol, because we're trying to get everybody out of here on time, which is why I said earlier that we unfortunately decided we can't. But if somebody, maybe Chris could circle back with him and ask him that question, and we can get it out to everybody, via email, or put it on the website or something.
So Guy, if we get the slide deck, it's on his last slide, the QR codes at least.
Oh,
Yeah, we could get it
Oh.
from him and share that out. He had, I think, 4 different links on that last slide.
Yeah, I was actually sharing his slides, so I do have them. I will get his permission to share them before doing so, though.
Right. I'm going to close this in prayer. We really are down to our last minute. I would ask for those of you who were volunteering tonight, if you would be able to stay on for about a 15-minute debrief. That we found that very helpful last week. Some got off before we could grab everybody. The rest of you, I will pray you out, and look forward to seeing you next week. So we would all assume an attitude of prayer. Gracious and loving God, God of justice, God of mercy, God of love, we know that this work is hard. We know that it is uncomfortable. It is at times dangerous. It is difficult work, and yet you call us to do it. You call us to be in relationship. You call us to get together to solve the problems that have plagued this nation and this world for so long. Nothing is impossible, Lord, without you and with you in our very being. We know that it is not impossible. We just ask that you continue to guide us through the promised Holy Spirit, that we will continue to know the way forward. We ask all of this in the name of a brown-skinned Savior, Jesus our Christ. Amen.
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 Best wishes all.
Have a good week, everybody.